This is lecture 2 for week 15 of CS 1030. In this lecture segment, we're just going to sort of quickly go over some Java stuff, and most of it is stuff we've talked about already, so this will be kind of quick. So let's talk about what you can do in Java. You can declare and optionally initialize a variable. So int value makes a new variable called value and assigns it to value 0 implicitly. So you didn't have to say it to 0. Java just initializes it by default to 0 if you didn't give it a value. And this int value equals 5 makes a new variable called value and initializes it to 5. So you could, of course, just initialize a value, create a variable called value here, and then assign it to 5 in the next line of code. But it's more concise and sort of better to do it this way if that's what you intend to do. So some kind of basic ways to output stuff to the screen. If you say system.out.println, that means take whatever the string is that's an argument to the println method and emit it to the screen with a new line after it. So this will print a message, and then the terminal will go to the next line of output. If you print the value of a variable, or if you pass a variable as the argument to println, then whatever the value of that variable is what's going to get printed onto the screen, again with a new line after it. If you do system.out.print instead of println, it's going to print whatever you told it to print. Here it's a string call, it doesn't go to the next line. And then in this case, it's not going to go to the next line. Most of the time you don't do that. Most of the time you use the println version, but the print is also available. So Java has several different loop constructs. Two of them that we talked about are for and while, and we'll look at the for loop again in a little bit later. Comments, if you recall, are things in the code that are not looked at by the computer at all. They're notes to either you or to some other programmer who reads your code in the future. And comments in Java that are a single line, that is to say the end of the line sort of implicitly terminates the comment, start with 2 forward slashes. And then comments that can span multiple lines if you want them to are started with /*, and then you put whatever you want in the middle, and then */ terminates the comment. And that's a convention that's used by many different programming languages. So for example, C++ has exactly the same convention for comments. So variables in Java. So mostly we haven't talked about a lot of different types of variables in Java, but let's sort of look at a few more now. So we have already talked about int type, which holds integer numbers. And the range of an integer number in Java is minus 2 billion to 2 billion. So they're 2's complement integers that are 32 bits. So that gives you a range of 4 billion. And since it's signed, since it's 2's complement, the range is spread evenly or almost evenly over the negatives and positives. You have doubles. Doubles are floating point numbers, and we haven't talked about floating point numbers at all, but these are what numbers in Scratch usually are. These are numbers that can have a decimal part. So if you declare a new variable called val, which is of type double, and give it the value 2.35, then this is a variable that'll hold that kind of a fractional value. And a double is 64 bits big. A double is sort of a large value, and they can hold a tremendously wide range of values. And so they're sort of super useful in practice when you're talking about continuous quantities, like the volume of a sound or something like that. You can declare a char variable in Java, so it's a single character. So char letter makes a new variable called letter and assigns it the initial value a. And you can denote single character constants in Java using these single quotes. And if you want to declare a string that's multiple characters, then you use the double quotes like we saw in the previous slide. And the final type we're going to talk about is the Boolean type. And of course, this is the same as Booleans that we've seen in other languages. And what these do is they're variables that can only hold true or false. So they basically contain only a single bit. And it's generally the case that these use up more than a single bit of storage on a computer because, as we've talked about before, computer memory isn't bit addressable, it's byte addressable. So it's generally the case that a byte is the smallest amount of bits that's convenient to work with. But the language only lets you store 2 different values in the Boolean variable, and it's true or false. So we can initialize a Boolean is true to true. And if we don't provide an initializer for a Boolean, it initializes to false. And that's not sort of necessarily a super obvious thing to initialize it to, but it had to be one of true or false. And so Java just picks false. So let's talk about for loops a little bit. So if you remember, a for loop has 4 different parts. There's an initialization part here. It declares a new variable I that's an integer and makes it 0. And again, you didn't need that, but that's sort of nice to, if you want somebody reading the code to understand that it was initialized to 0, then that's an okay thing to do. It doesn't make the code slower or anything. The loop repeats while I is less than 10. So that's the condition for the for loop. The increment part of the for loop, and remember the increment doesn't actually have to increment something, but here it is incrementing something. It makes I bigger by 1 each time it's executed. And then the body of the for loop is whatever Java statements you want to put there. So those are the 4 parts of a for loop, and let's just sort of go over again quickly the sequencing of those because it's not super obvious. The way it works is we first execute the start part of the for loop, or the initializer part, and then that's the only time it ever executes, unless we get to this line of code again, because there's some looping closing it. Then we execute the condition. As long as the condition is true, we execute the increment part, and then, we execute the condition. As long as the condition is true, we do the body, then we go to the increment part, and then the sequence repeats. So we check the condition again, we execute the body again, and we do the increment part. And this goes as long as the Boolean expression A is true. And again, the start part doesn't get repeated.